Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to philosophy. This is Professor Paul Hicks. And today we're going to continue our journey in philosophy. We're going to start talking about political philosophy here. And in particular, we're going to talk about the second treatise of government written by the philosopher John Locke. Now, you may be familiar with John Locke's epistemology. He was the one that argued against innate ideas and argued in favor of primary and secondary qualities, right? So today we're going to talk about his political philosophy in the book, The Second Treatise of Government. You're going to find a lot of similarities in the political philosophy that you were probably raised with in John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. So John Locke's dates are 1632 to 1704. Now you may ask yourself, okay, the Second Treatise of Government, that must mean there must have been a first Treatise of Government. And why aren't we studying that? Well, the first Treatise of Government, what Locke is arguing against is the concept of the divine right of kings. So anybody that believes there's a right for a king to rule because they're a descendant of Adam. This was coming from Sir Robert Filmer, Patriarchia, which was a defense of the divine right of kings. It was published in 1680, where he deals, and Locke deals with all of this in the first treaty as a first refutation. It was held in the divine right of kings that a king had the right to rule because God chose that particular person to rule. That is, it was their divine right to actually rule. And it was argued that because God gave the earth to Adam, and then Adam had all this power to control the earth, and when Adam dies, his son gets it. When the son dies, his son gets it. When the son dies, his son gets it, so on and so on and so forth. So that is, it's an inherited divine right of kings. So what Locke argued was that was absolutely ridiculous, right? He thought that to be able to think that anybody here is a descendant of Adam, to know that would be lost to history. There's no way that we could possibly do that. And even if we could, there doesn't say anywhere that Adam had some sort of natural right of dominion. It doesn't say that his children have it, right? So even if they did, it doesn't say how it would be transferred from one generation to the next. And even if there was a means of transferring power, the line has clearly been lost to history, so nobody can really legitimately claim it. So what do we do then? What kind of society, what kind of political system should we actually follow, if not the divine right of kings? So for Locke, there needs to be another justification for government and political power. So what Locke argues is that political power is not the same as, say, the power of a father over his children, or a master over a servant, the power that a husband has over their wife. All right, a little sexist here, I got it. And say the power of a lord over the slaves. He thinks that all of these are very distinct powers. So who is he arguing against here? He's arguing against the philosopher Plato, who argued that there is a certain form of the good. There is a certain form of power relationships, and that they're all somewhat the same, that they all take a certain form. Locke wants to argue against that. He doesn't believe that that's actually true. He doesn't believe in any form, so we go ahead and get rid of that. So how do we define political power for John Locke? Well, Locke argues that political power is, quote, a right of making laws and penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties for the regulating and preserving of property, and of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws, and in the defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this is only for the public good. All right, so what is the natural state of humans? What does it mean to be in a state of nature? So a lot of this type of talk is very common in modern philosophy. He's going to go against a particular philosopher by the name of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes argued that that in a natural state, when we talk about a state of nature, we're talking about a particular state where there is no government, there is no structured society. We're just, these humans running across the savannah, right? We're just in our state of actual nature and the way nature actually created us. What would that actually be like? Well, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short because everybody is always out to get the other person, and people realize that other people are out to get them. And so for Hobbes, we are naturally, I guess, bad in the sense of how we deal with each other. Locke is going to argue the exact opposite here. When in the natural state of man, Locke says is one of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit. All right? So the natural state of man is one of freedom. It's not a nasty, brutish, and short kind of life like Hobbes is actually arguing. So Locke thinks that since people are born with the same advantages of nature, they should really be equal in every respect, right? That is, humans are created equal. Now, only God, whom he calls the Lord and Master of them all, could declare clearly and explicitly who he wished to give the right of dominion and sovereignty to. So, though the state of nature, without any sort of government, is a state of liberty, it is not a license to do as we please with no constraints on how we behave. See, Locke thinks that human beings are the creation of God. And as a result, what follows from that for Locke is that we are the property of God. Okay, so what follows if we just take this for the sake of argument that we are the property of God? Well, one, if we are the property of God, we need to live as long as God chooses for us to live. That is, we cannot choose our own death. We cannot commit suicide. It would actually be wrong. You would be going and killing God's property. So it's not just a sin, say, against mankind. You're sinning against God himself. You're going against God if you were to commit suicide. Another thing that follows from this is we cannot destroy one another as if we were made for our uses. According to Locke, we're not animals, right? And animals are naturally inferior and can be used for our uses, but we can't treat other human beings that way because human beings are more special than animals, right? They're not inferior. Everybody is created equal. Well, so if we can't take our life, we can't take the life of another. What is it that we can try to understand what we should in fact do? Locke argues that we have a responsibility to attempt to preserve the rest of mankind. So what does that mean? We can't kill other people. This is where murder is actually wrong. This is why murder is actually wrong. There's an answer to that particular question. So we may not, unless it is to do justice to an offender, take away or impair the life or what tends to do the preservation of life, liberty, health, limb, or the goods of another. So, in the state of nature and by natural law, we have a right to punish any transgressors against us. But since we're naturally equal, everybody has a right to punish equally. So we cannot punish with unconditional power, but we can only punish to such a degree as to stop the violation of the law further. That is, we have only a power to punish a criminal so far as calm reason and conscience say is proportionate to his crime, namely, as much punishment as may serve for reparation and restraint. So we don't have this right to just punish in any way that we want, and this is, once again, going directly against somebody like Thomas Hobbes. There is only one reason, Locke says, that we may infringe upon another's natural rights. All right? That is the offender. So the offender is the one who's responsible for his punishment. So if somebody commits a crime against me, that person who committed that crime when they committed the crime against me was the author of their own fate. So they broke the natural laws, and he declares to live by some sort of other rule other than the reason of reason and common fairness that the rest of us are living by. And so that person is sinning against all mankind. Furthermore, the victim of a crime, according to Locke, has an additional right to seek reparation from whoever transgressed against him. So if we were to put this together, there are two very distinct rights. The first, the right that everybody has to punish a criminal so as to restrain him, and the right that an injured party has to get reparation. We get this out of natural law. So while a magistrate may cancel the punishment of a criminal offense if it is determined it is not in the public interest, the magistrate cannot cancel the reparation to the injured party. This can only be done by the injured party. So say if you rob me and maybe the courts say, well, it's not in the best interest of the state to go ahead and punish this particular person, you still owe me whatever you robbed of me. I'm the only one that would be able to get you out of that contract. So, all right, so if somebody injures you in some sort of way, then you are allowed to get reparation. Okay, what about a crime such as murder? How do you get reparations for murder? See, a murder can't be compensated for. Well, according to John Locke, then, we have a right to kill murderers. See, lesser breaches of the laws, they're not going to be able to be punished by death because the only proper punishment is to the degree that will do, one, suffice to make it an ill bargain to the offender. That is, you don't want this person to, think this is a good thing to do. We want them to think that there's going to be bad consequences here. Two, to give him cause to repent. And three, we want to terrify other people from doing it. Right? This is what proper punishment should be. One, suffice to make it an ill bargain to the offender. Two, give him cause to repent. And three, terrify others from doing it. This is the point of any sort of legal system at all. That's what we're supposed to be doing. So what Locke argues, in the state of nature, everyone has a right to judge cases to enforce the law of nature. But it is unreasonable for a man to be a judge in his own case because from self-love, this is going to bias an individual. And that is that the person will probably punish the offender too seriously. And so how do we stop somebody from punishing somebody too seriously? Well, we have civil government. And civil government is going to be the proper remedy for the inconveniences that are in the state of nature. But here's the thing, since when these other philosophers have talked about, say, divine right of kings and that a monarch should actually rule, the problem here is that in an absolute monarchy, the monarch is himself the judge of his own case, but he's just a mere man. And so, according to Locke, it's better to remain in the state of nature than to allow for a mere man to have so much power. All right, just think about that. In a monarchy, where one person rules and has all of the power, right? They're judge, jury, and executioner. Are they going to be biased in their own favor? Most likely. And so Locke is thinking that monarchies are bad here. So a lot of people say, okay, philosophers, this whole state of nature idea, this is just some thought experiment. You're just thinking about whether or not what are humans like in the state of nature? But humans have never been in this state of nature, right? Where are men that live in the state of nature here? Well, Locke actually has an answer for that. He says there are people that live in the state of nature. For example, monarchs and rulers. They're in a state of nature because nobody, if you're a monarch or a ruler of a country, you are the law. You make the laws. And there's nothing above you. And as such, if nobody's above the monarch could do whatever they want. That is, they are in fact in that state of nature. Also, say if some men were who made promises on a deserted island, or between, he says, a Swiss and an Indian in the woods of America, right? The binding of the truth of their promise keeping belongs to them as men, not as members of a society, and as such, they are in a state of nature. This is obviously, I think, a little bit racist here when we're talking about, Native Americans being, there's this tone that Native Americans are uncivilized, they're not within a society, and so, any sort of promise keeping or anything that you have is just between two people, right? But there's no society over Native Americans. This is going to be a problem a little bit later on in the second treatise as well. Okay, so let's talk about the state of war. So with Thomas Hobbes, who John Locke is going against, he argued that the state of nature is a constant state of war, of one person trying to get over on another person and that person trying to get over on everybody else, right? There's always everybody's fighting to get on top. So that the state of nature is a state of war to Thomas Hobbes. But Locke wants to argue against that. Somebody is in a state of war when they declare by word or action, not as a sudden outburst of rage, but as a matter of calm, settled design that he intends to end another man's life. That is the state of war, according to John Locke. Okay, so what's going to happen here is that this is going to put him in a state of war against other man and anybody who wants to join him. And so it would be reasonable and just that I have a right to destroy anything that threatens me with destruction. Because the fundamental law is what? I must preserve mankind as much as possible. And I may destroy any man who makes war against me. So any time anybody tries to get me into their power without my consent, this is what plunges us into a state of war. It's not that we're automatically just by living and surviving in a state of war. Somebody actually has to do something, right? Somebody has to declare by word or action, not a sudden outburst of rage, but a matter of calm, settled design that he intends to end another man's life. So anytime somebody does this to you, they have, without consent, plunged you into a state of war. Now, here's the thing. I don't need to know that somebody intends to kill me. See, for once I'm in their power, they can do as they please. So I can assume that he'll want me to do something which is against my own freedom, and therefore reason tells me to look upon any such man as an enemy to my survival. So for example, if somebody, say, was breaking into my house, I don't know if they're going to try to kill me. I don't know what they're going to try to do. Maybe they're just going to take my TV. Maybe they're going to take, some jewelry or some money or something like that. Those are possibilities. Or they might try to kill me, or they might try to rape my wife, right? They might do all these horrible things to us. That's a possibility. So I know once somebody breaks the law going into my home and they try to take me under their power, I can go ahead and assume that what they're trying to do is to go ahead and kill me. So it's lawful, according to John Locke, for me to kill a thief because they are attempting to put me under the power. So Locke goes on to argue that once the actual force is over, that we then need to appeal to the law. I can't say go after that person and try to punish them. You need to appeal to the law at that point in time. So if somebody, say, is attempting to steal from me now, I have the right to defend myself. But if somebody already did steal from me and have left, and I'm no longer in danger, then I need to defer to the law at that point. Okay, so what have we shown here? According to Locke, the state of nature and the state of war are two distinct states. Those that treat them as the same are mistaken. Once again, we're going back to Thomas Hobbes here, right? So in the state of nature versus the state of war, one is a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, whereas the other, the state of war, is enmity, malice, violence, and mutual destruction. They are, in fact, very different states. And so Hobbes was actually wrong, according to John Locke. So, what is the state of nature? How can we define what the state of nature? How do we describe it? Well, according to Locke, he describes it as follows. Men living together, according to reason, with no one on earth who stands above them both and has authority to judge between them. That is the state of nature. Compare that now to the state of war. According to Locke, the state of war is a man uses or declares his intention to use force against another man with no one on earth to whom the other can appeal for relief. Okay, so the state of war and the state of nature are very different. They're opposites states. They're not the same thing. Okay, let's talk about slavery if we can for just a bit. So for Locke, it's the natural liberty of man to be free from any superior power on earth and not to be under the will or legislative authority of men, but to be ruled by a law of nature. He says, quote, freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society and made by the legislative power erected in it, a liberty to follow my own will in all things where the rule prescribes not, and not to be the subject of the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature. So since man cannot by compact or his own consent enslave himself to anyone, nor put himself under the absolute arbitrary power of another to take away his life when he pleases. So since man cannot take away his own life, he cannot give his right or power away to another. Why? Because he didn't have it to begin with. I can't enslave myself. I can't give power to another person for me to be their slave. That's just, it doesn't work, because that power that I had comes from the state of nature, and ultimately, according to Locke, is going to come from God. So he says, he brings up, Exodus in the Bible. He says, even though the Jews of the Old Testament sold themselves, it wasn't into slavery, he says, but it was drudgery. Their master could not end their life or maim them. There is, according to Locke, one way that you can become a slave where it's perfectly justified in doing that. So how is this possible? Well, one, this is from being taken in war. So how do we justify something, right? Here's Locke talking about freedom, and we have the right to do it as we see fit. So how is it that we could ever possibly have slaves? And he says this in chapter 7, paragraph 85. Because when somebody declares war on you, you have the option to destroy them. What Locke wants to do is give the victor another option, right? That is to enslave them. The state of slavery is the continuation of the state of war between a lawful conqueror and a captive, in which the conqueror delays to take the life of the captive and instead makes use of him. Okay, so remember, if you were to come and try to attack me, I have the right to take your life. But let's say I don't want to take your life, right? You've already offered it to me by attacking me. You already offered me your life. You're giving your life away to me at this point. And I can do whatever I want now with your life. I can end it, or I can enslave you, and you'll just be my slave, and that's how life for you will go. So there is a justification of slavery there, but coming from Locke's point of view, that is, the person tried to attack you, and so therefore they are the author of their own fate. All right? Okay, let's talk about property here, because this is going to be important for the foundation of Locke's political philosophy. So in Psalms, we're told that God has given the earth to the children of mankind in common. Okay, so let's say God has given us the earth in common. How do we get private property out of that? How do we get property at all? How can we justify this through some sort of law of nature? Well, it must be the case that we should have some private property. So if we're considered the benefit of, say, fruit or meat, right? We have to eat. We take it to be ours. We can't truly share the food we eat, right? I have to have some food to keep me alive. I can't share that with you. I need to have my own. Well, that has to become private property. How do I get private property when we're supposed to have total property in common? That doesn't seem to make sense. Well, according to Locke, although the earth and all the inferior creatures are common to all men, there is something which man does own, and nobody has a right to. And what is that? That is his own body. So think about this for a bit. If you have a right to your own body, then you also have a right to your own labor, because your labor is taken from your body. It is part of your life. So if you own your own body, you must also own your own labor. So when you mix in your labor with what is held in common, the common property is no longer common, but it is rather your private property, because you mixed your labor in with it. So no man, he says, can have a right to another's labor or whatever his labor is attached to, as long there is left enough and as good in common for others. So remember, for Locke, we have to be concerned about the preservation of the rest of humankind. Okay, so let's go through this just a bit. So let's say I am, in an apple orchard, and there's just, apples growing, and, they're in the forest, and I want to eat them. How is it that they become my property? If all apples are to be held in common by all humans, how is it that it becomes my property? Well, what if I go around collecting apples? Then they're mine. If I pick the apples, then they are mine. They're mine alone. Why? Well, I put my labor into it. I own my body, which means I own my labor, which means if I take my labor and grab stuff out of common property, it will therefore become private property, because I own my body and my labor. So there are some restraints to this, of course. You just can't take anything you want. You have to leave enough for other people so that nobody can complain that I took what is considered common property, right? I can't take all the apples. That's not going to do me any good anyways. So I have to leave as much and as good for others. I have to leave other people the opportunity to have apples, right? All right, so since mixing labor with common property puts what was in common to now be private, can I hoard as much as I want? No. Locke says no to this. Why? Because the law of nature sets limits to property. See, I can only take what I can use before it spoils, and anything else more than my share needs to stay in common. So going back to the apples again, if I want to, pick apples, then I can't pick all the apples. I can't pick any more apples than what I can actually eat before they spoil. If they spoiled, then I wasted it, and I should have left it in common. Why do we have this? Because the law of nature states that I must preserve mankind, not just me. Okay, but what about the ownership of the earth itself? That is the actual land. Well, according to Locke, he says when man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of land, that land becomes his. And he can enclose it, right? He can fence it off from common use. If somebody's going to, say, grow wheat or grow apples or whatever it is they happen to grow, or whatever they're doing, they can enclose that land off to make that private property. He says, once I fence off the land that I work, nobody has claim to its title. Why? Because I took something that was held in common and I combined it with my labor, and therefore it became my private property. So Locke says, look, if you don't agree, just consider this. Imagine an acre of land that has not been cultivated. Nobody's done anything with it. Now imagine an acre of land where somebody has planted it, say, with tobacco, sugar, wheat, barley. Which one is actually going to be worth more? The one that's cultivated or the one that's uncultivated? See, clearly the acre that's cultivated is going to be worth more. Why? Why is one worth more than the other? Because somebody put their labor into it. It's the labor which made that land valuable in the first place. So most things used by man have value for just a short duration because they're going to decay and perish if not consumed soon. But there are things which Locke calls durable goods. These types of goods are things like gold, silver, diamonds. See, they have a value by agreement. They're not by, say, usefulness to survival. You may really like diamonds and you really like gold, but you could live without them. And as such, they're not, they're not going to spoil. You don't need them for survival. So remember what Locke has said so far. I can have as much as I want as long as I leave as good and enough for others. And I don't take so much that I can never use it before it spoils. So imagine that I gather 100 bushels of apples. Now, some are going to spoil soon. But here's what I can do. I can give some away to somebody else so they can use it before it spoils. Or for example, I might give you some apples, but you've picked plums. And so I'm going to trade with you my extra apples, and you're going to trade with me your extra plums. And so now I have variety. Gotta love variety, right? All right, so now I can trade it for some nuts, which might not spoil anytime soon. So remember, as long as it does not spoil while in my possession, it's okay for me to take as much as I want. I can trade it for, say, a piece of metal that has a pleasing color. I can trade those apples for a sparkling pebble or a diamond. And I can keep those all my life. Why? Because they will never spoil. I can take as many durable goods as I please. What makes it beyond my rightful property is not how much I have, but letting something spoil before it is used. And this, according to Locke, is how money comes into use. It's something which men can keep without spoiling, and we can trade it for what is truly useful to us. Right? Okay, so here's the thing. Going back here to this type of private property, things like gold and silver can be hoarded. People can have as much as they want. Things that have only value when it comes to the agreement of other people of what people value something as. It's not valuable because you need it for survival. It's valuable because, say, gold looks pretty, right? Something like that. Well, if it's not going to spoil, then you could go ahead and keep as much as you want of it, right? You can hoard as much as you want. And this, of course, now is going to translate into money. Money is something which doesn't spoil. It has only the agreement of what people give it. You don't need it for survival. So I can keep money and I can trade it for what I find to be useful. But money is a durable good, so I can keep as much of it as I want. All right, so we'll come back to this a little later as well. Okay, so let's talk about political and civil society for just a bit. So God made human beings to be a social creature. We don't live in isolation. We need each other to live. We know this because he gave man obligations of necessity, convenience, and inclination to drive him into a society, as well as gave us language and understanding to enjoy it. Why would God give us language to communicate with each other? Why would God have given us desires to stay with each other and build societies with each other? Well, he did it because we're supposed to. This is just the way God created us. He created us to be social. We are not to live in isolation. You can live in isolation if you want, but most of us are social beings. We need social relationships with other people. Well, if that's going to happen, there's going to be disputes when we come into society. So how do we settle disputes? Well, according to Locke, this is going to fall to a community to act as the umpire. There needs to be settled standing rules that are indifferent to all parties. And the umpire must be people who are given authority from the community to do a few things. 1, execute the rules. 2, decide differences. And 3, punish offenses which any member has committed against society. But these penalties and these laws must be pre-established, right? They need to be pre-established laws. There need to be standing laws. So we can now know who is and who is not in the political society. Those who are united into one body and have a common established law and judicature to appeal to, with authority to decide controversies between them and punish offenders, are in civil society with one another. But those who have no common appeal are still in the state of nature. So those in the state of nature must be their own judge and executioner. Well, in the creation of a commonwealth, and why we actually create one, is because we need the power to set down punishment for transgressions. I need somebody to have the power to, to hold somebody responsible for, say, harming me. We need the power to punish people who are not a member for committing a crime against a member. So think here, somebody like a terrorist like bin Laden, right? He's not a member of our society, but he committed crimes against members of our Commonwealth. Therefore, we, as the Commonwealth, would have the right to punish him. Anybody who has entered into the Commonwealth already agrees to this. When people enter into the Commonwealth, when they enter into their society, the political society, they agree to relinquish power to punish offenses. They allow themselves to be called upon to employ force for the execution of the judgments of the Commonwealth. That is, you're going to have certain obligations to society. Now, notice here, as a member of the Commonwealth, you have a say as to what the laws are and how they're to be carried out, either by yourself or some sort of representative, say like a congressperson. And so what happens here is we create two powers for the Commonwealth, which Locke calls the executive and the legislative power. And so what's going to happen here is we're going to have a legislative power where their job is to create standing laws to determine how offenses within the Commonwealth are to be punished. Then we're going to have an executive in the Commonwealth, and they're going to determine, based on particular circumstances, how far harms from outside the Commonwealth are to be defended and avenged. So, the Commonwealth has thus now been created anytime a group of men enter into a society to make one people, one body politic, under one supreme government, and they willingly relinquish their executive power and give it to the public. All right? So this is when the Commonwealth is created. We all get together, we make one people, we are one body politic, right? We stand together, right? We agree to submit ourselves under a particular government and relinquish any power that we had, say, to punish offenses, and that now goes to the government. All right, so according to Locke, therefore, any absolute monarchy is really going to be inconsistent with civil society. Why? Well, because a civil society is going to be set up to allow others to fairly and impartially judge any disputes by setting up a known authority to which every member can appeal to when he is involved in a dispute. But in an absolute monarchy, a monarch is one who has both legislative and executive power in one person and can therefore never be an impartial or fair judge to appeal to. An absolute monarch is therefore still in the state of nature and is never in any sort of civil society. All right? So in reference now to the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, he says, if you think that absolute power corrects the baseness of human nature, read history of this or of any other age, and you'll be convinced of the contrary. A man who would have been insolent and injurious in the forest of America isn't likely to be much better on a throne, possibly even worse, because as an absolute monarch, he may have access to learning and religion, and this stuff will justify everything he does to his subjects, and the power of arms to silence immediately all those who dare question his actions. So a monarch is against the idea of a civil society. Having a monarch means that you're against civil society itself. These two things cannot be reconciled, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of political society. So, since men are free by nature, nobody can be subjected to a political power without their consent. The only exception to this is to divest himself of natural liberty and agree to the bonds of civil society. But why would I do that? What do I get in exchange? Well, I get safety, peace, comfort. I get to secure enjoyment of my property. So since the only way a group of people can really act as one body is to be guided by the majority, therefore we are bound by the decisions of the majority. It's a democracy. The majority rules. Now, of course, we're never going to get absolute consent on anything. If we attempted to establish a society where everybody must consent on everything, what would happen? Nothing would ever get done. All right, just think about our society today. What would happen if we needed 100% consent in order to elect a president? We can barely get 50% to elect a president. We're not going to get 100%. And so what happens is we have to just go with what the majority says. Right? That's the compromise that we actually make. Well, since the only way man can be put under an earthly power is by his own consent, how are we to understand when somebody gives their consent? When did I ever give my consent, say, for example, to the United States or to the state of California? Well, we speak of an explicit consent and a tacit consent. So we all know when somebody gives explicit consent, they say, yes, you can do X, yes, you can do Y. But what about a tacit consent? How do we know when somebody tacitly consented to living under this society? Here's Locke's answer. He says, if a man owns or enjoys some part of the land under a given government, while that enjoyment lasts, he gives his tacit consent to the laws of that government and is obliged to obey them. This holds whether the land is the owned property of himself or heirs forever, or he only lodges on it for a week. It holds indeed if he is only traveling freely on the highway, and in effect it holds as long as he is merely in the territories of the government in question. So I agree to follow society's rules simply by living under society and taking the benefits from living under that society. I agree to follow a society's rules when I go to another country, for example, and maybe I'm just traveling through. Doesn't matter. I'm enjoying the safety of being able to travel through. As such, I have tacitly given my approval to that society and that government. So, when man unites himself to a commonwealth, he also unites his property, and just as he puts himself under the dominion of the community, he also puts his property under this dominion. Okay, so why is this important? Well, he says this: anyone who comes to enjoy that land, whether through inheritance, purchase, permission, or whatever, must take it with the condition it is already under, namely, submission to the government of the Commonwealth under whose jurisdiction it falls. But can a person divest himself of the government or community? Sure. Right? You can go ahead and say, I'm done. All you got to do, leave. That's your choice. You absolutely can do that. Okay. All right. But here's the thing. Why would anybody willingly put their property under the dominion of the state? What would be the point of doing that? Why would I give up my property and hand it over to the state to control? Well, according to Locke, because in the state of nature you have a right to property, but you find it that it's always in danger of being invaded and taken away by some. Therefore, you can never be certain that you're able to enjoy the use of your property. So, therefore, the great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. This is what the point of the government is. So that if I want to pick some apples and I mix my labor into it and it now becomes private property, that is my private property, well, I want to make sure nobody's going to come at night and steal my apples. Well, so I put myself underneath the government, then they are going to protect my property. So the purpose of government is for the preservation of property. It is for the preservation of private property. So according to Locke, man wants three things from a commonwealth. One, an established known law to give a standard of right and wrong, and for the law to act as a measure to decide controversies. Two, an indifferent judge to decide the controversies. And three, the power and support to back the execution of punishments. Well, if that's true, if those are the three things that man wants, then he must also be willing to divest himself of natural rights to the majority opinion of the Commonwealth. That is, he divests his right to do whatever he wants. He has to follow laws. You give up your right to be your own judge, and you give up the power to punish as you see fit. This now goes on to society in the Commonwealth, and we have for lack of better words, a government that's going to handle these things. So Locke does caution that nobody would ever consent to being worse off, so the power of the community can only extend as far than the interest of the protection of an individual's property for the common good. So remember, what is the point of the Commonwealth? To protect private property. I'm not going to join a Commonwealth if they're going to start stealing my private property. Why? Because that was the whole point in joining the Commonwealth in the first place. And that was the entire point of getting out of the state of nature and into the Commonwealth. Okay, so let's talk about the legislative power. So since men enter into society for their enjoyment and protection of laws, then the first and most fundamental part of any commonwealth must be the legislature, because the legislature makes the laws. So all men have consented to their legislature as a supreme earthly power and agreed to obey the commands of the legislature. Now, although the legislature will ultimately have a supreme command, it cannot do certain things. So, for example, it cannot have absolute arbitrary power over the lives of people. There has to be a purpose. There has to be a point to the laws you make. You can't just do it because you don't like this group of people or that group of people. You can't just say, hey, we're just going to make pepperoni pizza illegal on Friday. There's no point to that. That's just arbitrary power. Okay, so how is this justified? Well, this is because the power comes from the people, and they only have the power that they had in the state of nature. Nobody can transfer power that they don't have, and since nobody has absolute power to destroy his or anybody else's life, neither can the state. Nor can a man ever subject himself to the absolute arbitrary power of another. This has already been discussed with slavery. So they can never make any law which would violate a law of nature. And so the fundamental law of nature, being the preservation of mankind, the legislature cannot make laws against the preservation of mankind. The legislature can never rule by, say, sudden arbitrary decrees. It's bound to dispense justice and decide the rights of the subjects by published standing laws and known authorized judges. I have to be able to know what the laws are if I'm supposed to be able to follow them. I have to know what the system is that's going to judge me if, in fact, I transgress and break those laws. Also, we have to have the law that's the same for everyone. We cannot have a law which favors one group or the other. That is, we cannot favor, say, rich people over poor people, white people over non-white people. We need to have laws which favors all groups. Everybody counts here. Now, the laws must be made, once again, for the common good of the people. So no arbitrary authority, no one group is more important than another. Why? This is because governance without settled standing laws is inconsistent with the purpose of a society and government. So the supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his consent. And since the whole purpose of entering into a society is to preserve our property, you can't take it. So there's not much fear of this if the members of the supreme power change on a regular basis, for then they will not consent to arbitrarily take property. So you want your legislature, you want your leaders to be changed on a regular basis. You don't want anybody having power for a long, long time, because what's going to happen if they did something like that, right? That's not going to end well for us. Let's talk about taxes, shall we? The legislature has the power to levy taxes and require people to pay their share of maintaining the government. But any taxes must be by the consent of the people. Why? Well, because that's the point of our society, right? We need to have consent is given by the majority or given by the representatives of the majority, right? The legislature cannot transfer any power of making laws to anybody else. The legislature is the source of where laws are to come from, and we don't want that to go over, say, to an executive. That can be very, very dangerous. So let's think about this here for a bit. We are going to have a legislative branch of society, and in this legislative branch, they're going to make the laws. They're not going to execute the laws. They're only going to make the laws, and they have to be known laws. Now, because laws do not really take time to make, there should really be no need for a constant legislature. So if you think about what we have in the United States, we have a society where our legislature is a full-time legislature. Well, there's problems with that. According to Locke, we don't want a full-time legislature. Why? Because then they'll have so much power, and they will start abusing it. They need to go, say, from the United States, our representatives should go to Washington, D.C., make the necessary laws, then go home. You shouldn't sit in Washington, D.C. trying to gain as much power as you possibly can. And remember, he's in favor of them being turned over on a regular basis as well. Well, why do we not want a standing constant legislature? Well, if we had a full-time legislature, what are they going to do? They're probably going to make a bunch of laws that are really unnecessary, right? To fill their time, to feel like they're doing something. So we don't want that. A grasp for power may be really tempting if they're looking for something to do, and we need to be able to keep a rein on them. So if that's the case, we don't want a constant legislature. Well, what is the members of the legislature supposed to do, say, during their time off? Should they work in other parts of the government? Locke says no. Why? Because then they will have too much power. Having the power to both make laws and enforce those laws is going to be too much temptation for a human being. All right, you don't want somebody that has the power to make laws and enforce laws. Why? You're getting back into a monarchy, and Locke is not in favor of a monarchy, but rather in the majority rules, a type of democracy. Another reason that they should leave the legislature and go back to society is because by having them subjected to the laws that they've created immediately helps them to create only laws that they are in the common good. If all of the legislators, if all of the Congress people have to follow the laws that they actually make, they're going to only try to make good and fair laws, right? So since the laws that the legislature makes must have somebody available to execute them all the time, we need to make sure that the legislative branch of a government is separate from what he calls an executive branch of government. There must be a separate power which can also regulate disputes. So think about this. We have a legislative branch of government, which is to create laws. We have an executive branch of government, which is to enforce laws. But who's going to regulate disputes? Well, we might just need to come up with a third branch of government. So, what is this third branch of government going to be? Well, it will be a branch which will resolve any disputes. It will settle any reparations. This branch of government must also have the power to determine war, peace, leagues, and alliances, and all the transactions with all the persons and communities outside of the Commonwealth. Locke says we should call this power the federative branch. But he says also this, quote, "If anyone pleases so the thing be understood, I am indifferent to the name." So what is he saying? He's saying basically, look, I call it the federative branch, but you can call it whatever you want. I don't know. Maybe we'll call it, say, a judicial branch, shall we? So now we have three branches of government. We have a legislative power who makes laws, an executive power who enforces laws, and now a judicial power who decides amongst disputes, right? All right. Well, the legislative and federative powers are very distinct powers, and at times they need to be in the hands of different persons. But Locke thinks this may cause disorder because they're both responsible for forcing the public to do things, and if they're separated, they may begin to command different things. All right, so let's talk about the subordination of the powers of the Commonwealth. Although there are three separate powers, there must be one which is the supreme power that the others are subordinate to. Right? So they're not equal powers. And who's going to do it? The judicial branch, the executive branch, or the legislative branch? Well, the legislative branch, according to John Locke, is going to be the supreme power because it's a fiduciary, meaning that it's entrusted to work on behalf of the people. Right? They are representatives of the people. If you think about the House of Representatives, what does that mean? We send people to represent us in Washington, D.C. So the real supreme power will lie with the people if the representatives if the people can replace the legislature at any time they feel they've abused their power, then the legislature is actually good. The legislative branch is going to be the more supreme power to the other two. Okay. Excuse me for 1 second. So, for Locke, remember, the only just way for a government to rise is by the consent of the people. So we should never mistake the force of arms for the consent of people. What do we mean by that? We should never mistake the force of arms, that is, military strength, for the consent of the people. No colonization. No going out there and taking over other countries and colonizing them. Why? Because just because we can do it militarily doesn't give us the right, because the right to create a society is from the people themselves, the consent of the people. We can't go to another country and take it over. We need the consent of the people. And without the consent of the people, it's no good. Right? Would be going, once again, you'd be going against laws of nature, which is ultimately to go against God. So, according to Locke, any sort of conquest destroys a government, and it doesn't create a new one, and it doesn't have the consent of the people. So just because we can militarily take over another country and do maybe some nation building doesn't mean we should do it. In fact, we should stay away from doing things like that, because we should only have government of the consent of the people. But what power, let's say we do go to war, what power does the conqueror gain over the conquered? Well, he gets no power over those who assisted him in battle, because the soldiers were freemen before, and they'll be freemen after. So any spoils of war really must be shared with them. The conqueror gets no power, but only over those who have actually assisted, concurred, or consented that the unjust force that is used against them. Those that are just members of the community who didn't actually fight in war, who did not consent or participate in the war, they are not to be harmed. They did nothing wrong to warrant their governors to do an unjust thing. Those who participated in the war, remember, the conqueror gets their lives, but they do not get their possessions. Why? Because when you declare war against me, I can enslave you. I can take your life, right? Your life now belongs to me. But you forfeited the life by engaging in the unjust war, but you didn't forfeit the property, right? So typically those of conquering countries speak of their right over another possessions by saying, he conquered it. But Locke cautions us. He says, the practice of the strong and powerful, however universal it may be, is seldom the rule of the right. Just because people have the power to do something doesn't mean they have the right to do something. All right. So the misdeeds of the father are not going to be the fault of the children. So while the father who made war against me may forfeit his life, and the conqueror cannot involve his children in his guilt or his destruction, as such, the property doesn't go to me or to the military that destroyed the country, it goes to the children, right? It goes to their children. So because men have a right to inherit their father's goods before anybody else, it would be stealing if the conqueror took it. Okay, so there's a brief overview of John Locke's second treatise of government. It's very similar to the type of government many of you probably endorse and have been raised with, that ultimately, for Locke, natural law has been created by God, and we need to follow natural laws, these laws of nature. And only by following these laws of nature are we really following the rules that God has set up for us as the creator of all things. And so these laws, we are endowed by our creator with certain rights. And they're unalienable rights. Why? Because God gave them to us. And we are endowed by our creator, right, with certain inalienable rights that for Locke, among these are going to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. This is what Locke says. Among these rights are our pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Why else do we have a government? We have a government to protect our property and to protect our lives and to protect our liberties. That is the point of government. And all of this comes from the laws of nature, which all come from God. All right? Well, okay, so there's John Locke's second treatise of government. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you guys later. All righty, bye-bye.